Rise up!
This is the Rise Up See Red podcast, all about the Arizona Cardinals and the NFL, featuring insider and outsider perspectives. Enjoy the best hour of Cardinals talk on the web. Now here are your hosts, Jess Root and Seth Cox.
Hello, Arizona Cardinals fans, and welcome to the latest edition of the Rise Up See Red podcast. I'm your host, Jess Root from CardsWire.com, the Arizona Cardinals site from the USA Today NFL Wire. And tonight, in this edition of the show, episode 350, we have Seth Cox from RevengeOfTheBirds.com, and also coming back again to visit with us is Justin Higdon, who is Seth's co-host from the original Draft Breakdown podcast. Seth, good as always, we've got you, and Justin, welcome back to the show. How have things been?
Oh, thanks for having me on. Things have been great. Just Seth and I are, neck deep in draft stuff. We had an episode come out earlier this week on iTunes. We're going to have another one coming out, as always, on Patreon later this week. We talked a little bit about NFL free agency, and we gave a lot of hot takes this week. So it's been a good week.
And we're recording on a Monday night this week, so we'll get the show a day earlier than normal. However, even though NFL free agency started today on Monday, that is not the focus of our show because, truthfully, by the time that I get this edited and published, we're going to be behind the times anyway. And so we're going backwards a little bit because last week we previewed free agency rather than talking about the Combine, which happened the first week of March. And so in this edition of the show, we're talking about the Combine. And next year, Seth and I will break down free agency for the Arizona Cardinals. And in this edition of the show, we're going to do more general, talk about, I'm sure, things that kind of will fit for the Cardinals. But between Seth and Justin, this is kind of a bonus edition of the original Draft Breakdown podcast, kind of driven by me a little bit. And so we're going to go through the different positions and talk about what the takeaways were, who stood out. Did anybody change anybody's mind on anything? We all are prisoners of the moment when it comes to the Combine, when someone puts up a good or bad numbers, and we've almost, too many of us feel like that kind of changes draft stock. I know Seth and Justin, and I try to as well, try to use the Combine as just sort of a piece that can either confirm or raise questions about what they saw on tape. Tell us, Seth and Justin, kind of the way you guys approach the Combine with the rest of the evaluation process.
Yeah, I mean, the Combine is a piece of the puzzle, and what it does is it should give us some baselines on their athletic ability, and give us an idea of, where guys fit in. And it's something that we'll talk about tonight. But one of the things we said on one of our shows this week is talking about chasing unicorns, right? And the Cardinals have had a couple of those unicorns that you can't compare other players to them, and you can't draft guys that test like them. Anquan Boldin is probably one of the biggest unicorns in NFL history because that dude was not athletic when it came to his athletic testing. And the fact that he went in the second round, produced, a rookie of the year type of season, then ended up being a Pro Bowler. I don't know if he ever made an All-Pro team, but, and is going to be a borderline, NFL Hall of Famer with his athletic testing numbers. People go, well, that's proof that you should just throw those numbers out. And it's like, no. Actually, he's just one of those freaks in the NFL lore that you can't compare guys to, and you can't go and justify, well, Anquan Boldin tested this way, so he should. You can take a guy that runs a 4.72 at wide receiver in the second round. Like that's one of those situations.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a good point. because what the combine does is it gives you historical context for a range of outcomes. So you can look at a guy's numbers in the athletic testing, the height and weight, and you can compare him across at least the last 20, 25 years of what players have done, what other players have done in that setting. And so like you have a spectrum of like what the outcomes are going to be. So when you look at, say, a David Bell, who's a receiver from Purdue, and you plug him in, and Anquan Bolden comes out as his closest comparison, and there's not really anyone else comparable, it's going to make you think twice about where you're going to draft that guy. So that's just one example. I think, we'll talk about it, but there might be a surprise or two that comes out of these combines, and where you have to go back and look and do some projecting, because the way they were used in their college scheme is just, it doesn't translate. So you're projecting that they're going to be used in a different way in a pro scheme, and they're going to get some more production because they're so athletic. But then you kind of get into some dangerous waters. So it's interesting. I don't think there were a ton of surprises this year, but there were a few, and it does make you go back to the tape, as we like to say.
There's some will wonder about the validity of some of these tests. Take for example the 40-yard dash. How often do you see linemen running 40 yards at a full sprint? And basically it comes down, we have so much more technology. We've got these next gen stats, GPS, so we could actually track how fast they can go for how long. Will we ever see these traditional workouts taken away?
Never say never, Jess, but one of the things the traditional workouts give us is that historical comparison that I'm talking about. They've been running the 40-yard dash since at least the 60s, I think maybe the 50s, and at least the legend has it that Paul Brown developed that as a testing mechanism, because that's kind of your distance on punt coverage. So if you're a punt gunner, that gives you an idea how fast you're going to get down there to cover the punt. So that kind of was adopted as the NFL speed test. If they change it up, they're going to have trouble comparing players across eras. And I think that's why there will be reluctance to do that.
Absolutely.
So I don't think you can say never, but one of the things, like GPS data is cool, but you've got an adrenaline factor there. And in the middle of a game, a guy being chased down, he might have a little bit of extra juice that he doesn't normally have. The testing, it kind of gives you like a measure of consistency, and that's why I think it's here to stay. But I could be wrong. 5 years from now, it could be all about the GPS data. I know teams are using the GPS data right now. So,
and the combine was supposed to be, the ability to take away all of the other situations and be your control environment, right? So it was, everybody's running on the same track, everybody's lifting on the same bench, everybody's jumping at the same, we've talked about it before, you and I have, Justin, and then obviously Justin and I talk about it all the time, but the what do they call it, 38.5-yard 40 at Ohio State, right? Like,
right. Virginia Tech was notorious for that too.
Right. And so, you look at those places, and then that's what you say to yourself, right? Is okay, well, the combine is in theory a controlled environment where everybody's doing everything the same. Now, people will complain because they'll say, well, these guys are getting woken up, at 3 a.m., 4 a.m. in the morning, and so they're maybe not as rested or this or that. And that's sometimes true. It absolutely is. But when you have everything in one area and you're able to really control things and have Tom, Dick, and Harry all run on the same track, it gives you a more clear cut
At least
idea.
an athletic
Right,
norm.
right, exactly. And so, I don't think it'll ever go away because one, was it last year, Justin, or was it 2 years ago that we made fun of all the Exos numbers because like guys were running like everybody's running a sub 4.4.
Right. It was last year because we didn't have a combine. So
Right,
what we had was like an amalgamation of pro days and
And they're
and
all self-serving, of course. These
right.
are training places that are showcasing their athletes, and magically all of these athletes who are at their facility test amazingly.
100% Jess. And one example I'll give is Jonathan Adams. He's a receiver from Arkansas State. And when Exos numbers came out, he had I believe a four, somewhere in the neighborhood of a 4.3940. When his actual pro day numbers came out, the scouts had him measured closer to 4.59. So you're going to have those discrepancies. He was still a pretty athletic dude. He still had good for a good vertical, good broad jump. So you have that explosiveness, but you didn't have that 40 time. Now, then on the other hand, you had the LSU Pro Day where Jamar Chase and Terrace Marshall both ran sub 4.4s. Well, certainly Jamar Chase looked like he is a sub 4.4 guy. So, but it's a lot more guesswork when you have this versus when you have an actual combine where you can get, quote unquote official results that are comparable across the board. Because, some of those hand times were sketchy this year. They went back, they looked at the video, and they adjusted those times. And there was a lot of criticism about that for the combine this year, but I think they got it pretty close.
All right, so what I want to do for what we got the remainder of the show is kind of break it down by position, go by group, quarterbacks and receivers, running backs, tight ends, offensive linemen, interior defenders, the edge, linebackers, and then go defensive backs. Kind of go through overall takeaways, surprises, and basically what we learned. I don't expect that we'll take a lot of time on quarterback, essentially being a Cardinals-focused podcast. The Cardinals have really no need to look at quarterbacks, but talking quarterbacks first. Did we learn anything about the quarterbacks in this group other than Pickett's got small hands?
Pickett has small hands, and Desmond Ritter's an elite athlete. I think those were really the two biggest takeaways from this whole thing. Ritter ran a 4.5240 and measured in at 6'3", 211. I mean, that's like good running back. I mean, he's actually tall for a running back, but you get what I'm like. That's a solid, strong safety build right there. Like that's a guy that has the goods. 36-inch vert, decent short shuttle and three cone. So I mean, really good athlete. A guy that
He's a quarterback who plays special teams really well, right?
Right, exactly. And so, you look at it that it when you watch him play, it's not surprising. But I think the fact that because since he's kind of notorious for overshooting their prospect sizes in their official books, but they, to see him come in at 6'3", 211, and then test like he did, he's a guy that has a chance to be a starter in the league because of his athleticism. His biggest concern is probably his ability to push the ball into tight windows, but athletically he'll be able to make, really solid plays. So,
It's funny because after that first group of receivers went, like Ritter was faster and more athletic than a lot of the guys in that first group of receivers. So We had Emery Hunt on our show a couple weeks ago, and he made a comparison of Ritter to Marcus Mariota, right? So Mariota went number 2 overall in that draft, but I think if people remember back to our old show, Seth and I were not high on that class, and we didn't love Mariota that early, and it turned out we weren't too far off, right? But so Emery's comparison was to kind of how Mariota turned out. So if you have that hindsight, you can say, well, Mariota's not like a top 5 draft pick, but he would have been like a pretty solid day 2 draft pick. So I have another comparison. What I landed on was Geno Smith, who went early in the second round. And I think if you're taking Desmond Ritter in that range, early in the second round, or as Seth and I talked about earlier in the week on our podcast, baby Ritter sneaks into that 32nd overall pick to Detroit. Then it seems more logical, more reasonable. But I don't think he's the type of quarterback prospect that you take early in the draft. He's obviously a very athletic guy. He has good arm strength, but he doesn't have that timing, that accuracy. That's not honed yet. So I would be hesitant if I'm a team looking for a starting quarterback. I wouldn't think he's my future starter. I would think he would be like a project or maybe a stopgap for me. So I don't, but I don't think it wasn't really a surprise that he was athletic, nor was it a surprise that Kenny Pickett has small hands. We knew those things coming in. It's just that we got it validated. So, to answer your bigger overarching question, there were no surprises for me at quarterback in this year's combine.
What about at the running back position? Were there any guys that athletically stood out enough to say, okay, let's look at this guy again?
I think Breece Hall solidified being the running back 1 in this class with his speed and explosiveness. He ran a sub 4.4. He had a 40-inch vertical, came in at good size, 217. I think that the surprise was Isaiah Spiller not running and then having subpar jumps. So it makes you think that he's probably slower than you would like. Which is disappointing because he's a player who has really good running back tape. He performed very well in the SEC, the toughest conference in college football. But you don't have if you really like him as a prospect right now, you don't have anything to hang your hat on.
I think a guy like Zamir White surprised us a little bit just because we knew he was a track star. Coming out of high school, but he's had 2 ACL injuries since then. And so for him to come in and run a 4.4 flat, have decent jumps, it's one of those situations where you can validate taking him if the medical's checked out on day 2, because you're talking about an elite athlete at the running back position, and maybe you're able to take him and, use him up, so to speak, over the course of a couple years and then move on from him. But I mean, he tested out really well. Another guy that, I thought tested well was the kid with Kenny Walker. And, we talked about Kenny Walker quite a bit. I didn't see a guy that was a 4.38. Is that what he ended up being? A 4.38. I didn't see a 4.38 guy on tape.
It's hard for me to imagine that he's faster than Jonathan Taylor.
Right. and so when you look at it from that perspective, that was surprising. I mean, we've talked about it. Walker was probably running back 2 or 3 going in. Like Justin said, with the not that Spiller has done anything negatively to impact his draft status. It's just that he didn't do well in the jumps, and then he hasn't run yet, so we don't really know exactly where he's going to fall to. And then a little bit on a local product, Rashad White measured in at 6'4", 214, had a good 44.48, but his jumps were really impressive. He had a 38-inch vertical and a 125-inch broad jump. It's he's a guy that you could see being a good player in this league, and those testing numbers kind of showed that he is a guy that can be in a rotation in the NFL and be productive.
Yeah, we've seen a number of ASU running backs over the last few years have something in the Marion Grice didn't turn out to be anything. DJ Foster, he had a really nice career in special teams. Spending some time with the Cardinals. You got Benjamin now. Kalen Balaj kind of has a little niche in the league right now, but it would be nice to see if someone could pan out as a running back, and someone of White's size and movement ability makes it seem like he could be the guy to do more than just be a back of the roster guy.
He's got a little David Johnson thing going on, right? With his size and his testing. And I think with what people think his receiving ability can be. So I think he did well for himself. And it's kind of a wide open receiver class because, like, as Seth said, Kenny Walker's performance probably slots him solidly in at running back 2. After Hall and Walker, it's kind of wide open. And I don't think we're going to see a first-round first-round running back. But we should see Hall and Walker come off the board in round 2. And then after that, I think it's kind of the Wild West.
One more guy we should at least mention because he just put up such good numbers was South Dakota State's Pierre Strong. He had a 4.3740 at 5'11", 207. Good vert at 36 inches and then 124-inch broad jump. So, I mean, you're talking about a guy that's literally a speed demon. I think is it Raheem Mostert from San Francisco that was like the incredibly fast and athletic guy coming out? But I think it was. But
yeah, Mostert he was a really fast guy coming out of Purdue, but I don't think he was even drafted.
No, he went undrafted, but he did run
a 4.34. Yeah, so
yeah, and he on his draft scout page, his lowest time was 4.28.
Wow. Yeah.
Yeah, so I mean that's when you talk about Strong, similar size, speed, stature, a guy that could potentially, be a guy you take on day 3, but ends up being a good contributor in the NFL.
So Seth, if we're looking from a Cardinals lens, who are the best fits for what they do, and especially now as we realize that James Conner has now been re-signed on a 3-year deal. So anyone who comes in, anybody they draft would be at best their number 2, and would probably, especially if unless they go day 2, anybody they draft is going to be kind of brought in slowly, like Chase Edmonds was, and Benjamin to a little bit lesser extent this year.
Yeah, I think, and Justin mentioned him on our Patreon episode. Ty Chandler of North Carolina transferred from Tennessee, 5'11", 204, ran a 4.3840. So he gives you that kind of smaller breakaway speed ability, but he shows good ability to run inside the tackles as well, but he's got true game-changing speed. He's a guy that you could probably find on day 3. I mentioned Strong a little bit. Another guy that, again, a little undersized, but put up really impressive numbers and had a really solid career at Iowa was Tyler Goodson. You know, you watched him run, and I don't know if you saw a 4.42 guy. I don't know if you did, Justin. I sure as heck never saw a 4.42 guy, but
Well, I mean, I tweeted a clip from him earlier in the year where he had like a 67-yard touchdown catch. But yeah, you're right. I mean, it didn't scream like 4.4 guy, but there's something there. And I think the guys that you're mentioning are I think you're 100% right on these fits, especially with Chase Edmonds moving on now.
Coming up next on the Rise Up See Red podcast, the best of Cardinals talk. Let's move on to the pass catchers, wide receivers, tight ends. Who are the ones that stood out? What did we learn from them this incredibly fast class this year? That's coming up next on Rise Up See Red. We're back on the Rise Up See Red podcast, the best of Cardinals talk on the web. We've talked quarterbacks and running backs. Let's talk about the wide receivers and tight ends. I think, especially because it's the first day of workouts, you get the wide receivers. Probably the biggest takeaway was, holy fast. Is this a trend we're seeing? Are the wide receivers getting more athletic as the passing game evolves, becomes more and more important? Are we just seeing better receivers and more talented, more athletic receivers coming every year? Or is this an exception where they seem to be exceptionally fast?
I think that they're getting faster because of advancements in speed training, and I think what you're also seeing is in the past, where some of the better athletes in the class may have played running back throughout their college career, they're moving to receiver because of what you said with the advancements in the passing game. So it's been year after year after year recently where we're seeing these really strong receiver classes, and the guys are very athletic, and we have a lot of guys who are running sub 4.4 40s, and it used to be noteworthy, and now it's almost ho-hum that these guys are running sub 4.4. But this is another good receiver class. As I've talked about with Seth and on our shows recently, I still think there's only going to be like 4 receivers in the first round, but that doesn't mean it's not a good class. I think it's a little bit overstated how good the class is, but you still got at least 3 or 4 really, really good prospects in this receiver class, and then maybe another 7 or 8 who are solid day 2 guys.
So is it a deeper class per se, but not necessarily deep as in top talent, but in talent that can stick around in the NFL?
Yeah, I mean deeper than last year or the year before. I'm not so sure, but it is deep. It's another good class. It is another good class where you have a guy like I'll throw a name out, Sky Moore, who's going to go on day 2, probably 3rd round, maybe even 4th, who compares pretty favorably from an athleticism standpoint to like a Golden Tate. Now, if you can get a guy like that in the 3rd round, you're feeling pretty good. You've also got, the 2 Ohio State guys, Garrett Wilson, Chris Olave. Those guys are going to be stars. You've got Drake London, who I'm still very high on. I know some people think he's going to be really slow, but I don't. I think he's a very talented guy. He's coming off that ankle injury, though, so we haven't seen him run yet. And even Traylon Burks, who I'm kind of lower on than other people, I still think he's a prospect who compares favorably to Dwayne Bowe, who came out of LSU and had a good 5 or 6 years with the Chiefs before things kind of went south. You got Jameson Williams, who's going to when he's healthy, he's going to run a 4.3 40. He's coming off an ACL, but there are some really good players in this class at receiver, and but it's just different. What we've seen recently is receivers coming out smaller, thinner, but faster. So it's interesting. The historical comps kind of shift, but you still get some good outcomes. And I think this is a good class. I'm bullish on receiver in this class.
So if let's take some of the bigger names. So you've got Garrett Wilson, you've got Chris Olave, Drake London, Traylon Burks, Jameson Williams. Who are your favorite receivers in this class?
For me, Garrett Wilson is the top receiver in the class, and he's a first-round player. I think when you weigh out the grades that I'm going to give for this class, he's going to be like a top 10 player for me. That doesn't necessarily mean I think he's a top 10 prospect in normal years, but I like the comparison of Garrett Wilson to another Ohio State guy who had a good career, and that's Santonio Holmes.
Yeah, that name's actually banned on this podcast. Sorry.
But at 40 times, the size, the athleticism, the jumps, everything, it's a very good comparison. And I think they play with that same kind of edge. For me, London is probably receiver 2, and they're completely different guys. Then I like Olave. Then you're talking about receiver 4. I'm probably going with Burks because I think he's more like, because I like the Bo comparison. Although he was used so much in the slot at Arkansas that he was a gadget player for them. He was like almost like how Pitt used Tyler Boyd. But I think Burks can play outside. If you watch that Alabama tape, he had a great game against them, and he can play outside. So I like him as an outside receiver, as kind of a, I think he can be an X. I think he's a little faster than what he timed out at, what he tested, but it's a good group. Jameson Williams, love him. He's a Buckeye. I'm a Buckeye. But you got to be wary of that ACL for a speed guy. We want to make sure he's coming back fully healthy. He didn't have surgery right away, which tells me there was probably a meniscus involved because they had to wait for that swelling to go down. And Seth knows what I'm talking about. So we got to make sure he's not going to have some kind of long-term effects. So
Williams is interesting as well because coming off that ACL tear, a team who badly needs a receiver and would be willing to draft a guy in the first round, they're going to want production, or at least to play that first round. So it's going to be hard 100%. for a team to, unless they're already comfortable in their receiver situation, looking at a team at the bottom of the first round who's comfortable with their top 2 receivers. Maybe they've got one who's going to hit free agency in a year, so they can slowly bring him in his rookie year.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. I mean, some people would maybe connect the dots to like Green Bay, but Aaron Rodgers is 38, 39 years old. Tom Brady for Tampa, he's going to be 45. Like, these guys aren't going to be around for when Jameson Williams gets healthy. A team like Cleveland's not going to take Jameson Williams at 13, although they still have a need at receiver, because they can't wait till the middle of the year for him to get healthy. So I think he's going to fall out of the first round, where before his injury, he probably was in the running to be the first receiver picked. Not that I would have taken him as the first receiver, but it's unfortunate. I still think I really like him, and that 4.3 speed is legit, and I think he'll get back. The ACL surgeries that they do these days are fantastic, but I just wouldn't take him that early. I think he's probably going to be receiver 5 or 6 for me.
You had a guy like Williams that wasn't able to test, like you said, and then because of the knee injury. And then you had a Drake London who hasn't tested because of an ankle fracture. But you did have some really interesting guys outside of the known top guys. Justin mentioned Garrett Wilson. Chris Olave was a sub 4.4 guy, and it looked like he was jogging. You want to talk about a guy that just has a different kind of speed to him. And then you have guys that were a little slower, and I do mean a little, but that are really intriguing. He mentioned Sky Moore, more of a slot guy, probably not going to fit what the Cardinals want. But you got a guy like Alec Pierce, who, by all intents and purposes, was maybe the freakiest athlete of the wide receiver group. 6'3".
And Seth, I think he ran a 4.33 official.
Did he?
4.41 is what I've got listed here for Pierce.
Oh, you got 4.41?
Yeah.
Yeah. So he was 6'3", 211, 4.41, but he had a 40.5-inch vertical and a
Oh, jeez.
a 129-inch broad. We knew he was going to be a freaky jumper coming in because he was like an all-state volleyball player as well. So he's just a special athlete at that size at 6'3", 211.
Christian Watson, you and I talked about how just insane the numbers were for Christian Watson. 6'4", 208. He runs a 4.36, 38.5-inch vert. And he goes 136-inch broad jump, and then so Trey Lance and Christian Watson on the same offense, and they didn't throw the ball.
Right, exactly. And so that's the big thing with Watson is he's not got a lot of he doesn't have a lot of production over 4 years at a small school as a size speed freak. And that's always the biggest concern with these guys. Justin's talked about it before, and this isn't the comp in and of itself, but it's a pretty similar situation to Stephen Hill coming out of Georgia Tech when he was a triple option, wide receiver, but he tested like a complete freak of nature and then just never developed. If you're getting Watson outside of this top 50, I think you're in a good spot. If you're having to draft Watson back end of round 1 or one of the first picks in round 2, I just feel like you're really setting yourself up to be disappointed because this is just a guy that hasn't produced enough to justify that. And yeah, the 4.36 at his size is really, really astonishing. But you've got, like I said, you got an Alec Pierce who's the same type of player who's done it at a higher level, obviously at Cincinnati. You have a Jahan Dotson who played with absolutely dreadful quarterback play while he was at Penn State, and he looks like a guy that should be able to be at worst a good number 2 in the NFL. And then a guy that I've talked about before that I like, even though he ended up not being as big as we were sold, and that's why you always kind of wait for all of these numbers to come in. But that was like Jalen Tolbert. He came in at 6'1", 194. He only ran a 4.49, but he had a decent vertical and broad. He looks like a guy like a Marvin Jones type of player that has been in the NFL, I want to say, for 10 years and consistently produces. He's never going to be a number 1, but if he's your number 2, you're probably not going to be in a bad spot. Justin, I want to get your opinion on a guy we haven't talked about quite a bit, and that's another Georgia guy in George Pickens. 6'3", 195, ran a 4.47. Coming off a knee injury, I'm not worried about his jumps just because he is coming off that knee injury. Where do you see him kind of slotting into this wide receiver class? Because from a name perspective, I feel like he's going to go higher than what some people think. I'm going to guess he goes in the top 50.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with that. I am pretty high on Pickens. He's my receiver 5 in this draft. So that translates to probably a guy who's a borderline first round pick, because I think there are going to be 4 receivers picked in the first round. So I think Pickens ultimately goes high in the first round, but he's a great example for you to bring up because as we just talked about Christian Watson, would you rather take a 23-year-old FCS guy who you know admittedly had great testing, or would you rather take a guy who's 2 years older from the SEC who also had very good testing and who has like some really remarkable film against some very good teams, much better than the FCS competition that Watson's faced. So you look at Pickens, he had that fantastic diving catch in the FBS playoffs where he laid out, caught the ball, rolled over, kept the ball off the ground. It was a fantastic textbook catch. Um, you know, when you do the athletic comps, you don't have a lot to work with because he didn't do the full range of testing and he did come in under 200 pounds. But you can come up with a guy like Ashley Lilly, and that doesn't sound flashy, but he was a first round pick and he had a decent career. So if you're talking about a floor career comp, that's not too bad. That's really not. I'll take Pickens over Watson and several other receivers over Christian Watson too. I like Pickens. I think he's put up good tape against tough competition. He did have the ACL injury, but he came back in time to play not only in the playoffs but in the SEC championship game. So, guys, it shows me he has a good work ethic. I really like him. I think he's going to be a good player.
Looking at the tight end group, is there obviously when you're looking at some of the athletic stuff, you see the numbers from Trey McBride. He's the fastest of that group. Did he show that he? I've heard comments about but I've heard he was super productive for Colorado State, athletic but not necessarily explosive. Is that and I know he didn't do some of the jumps. He did the vertical, he did the 40. Did McBride match what was shown on tape?
I don't think so. I think McBride, in this draft season, he measured a little bit smaller than what we thought and what was advertised. I think he's more of an H-back type than a true inline tight end. And tight end is traditionally a position where rookies come on very slowly. Like, you don't have a ton of tight ends who hit the ground running as rookies. And especially in a class like this where I don't think there's going to be a first-round tight end. So I think the door is wide open for a guy like Jeremy Ruckert from Ohio State, who came in at 6'5", 250, but who didn't test at the combine, to have a great pro day and emerge as the tight end 1 in this class and go in the middle of the second round or even early third round. So, McBride had great stats. He had flashy stats, lots of catches, lots of yards, not a lot of touchdowns this year. And Seth and
was
I
it 90 catches, only 2 scores?
Right. And Seth and I named him the tight end of the year for our podcast. But when it comes to prospect, I think there is something left to be desired because this is a guy. He was at the Senior Bowl. He came in, like I said, more H-back size. I think there's tape of him being well covered by Jalen Petrie, who's like a honey badger sized safety. And to me, that's more impressive for Petrie from Baylor than it is for McBride, who, even though in a lot of those clips he makes the contested catch, but you're talking about a 6'3.5" guy, 245 pounds, against like a 5'10", 195 safety. So, color me unimpressed. I think this tight end class has a lot of players who are decent, and they're going to have good careers. But think of Harrison Bryant for Cleveland, who was a 4th-round pick. I don't think there's no Gronks in this class for sure.
A couple of guys that jumped out that were a little surprising from an athletic testing standpoint. The first one was Jelani Woods out of Virginia. He was a transfer from Oklahoma State, went to Virginia and put up massive numbers this year. In his career, he was...
Seth, shout out to the Shrine game. They had him there. And he was a quarterback recruit, which is also interesting.
Right. And so he was... he had... I'm trying to add it up real quick. 31 receptions in his 3 years at Oklahoma State. He had 44 receptions for just under 600 yards and 8 touchdowns this year at Virginia. He came in at 6'7" and 260 pounds, ran a 4.6 140. He is a big dude, massive size, good length at 34-inch arms, which is unheard of. It's crazy to see what he did in the combine, because it made you want to go back and watch what the hell Oklahoma State missed and how did Virginia not do better. And then you're like, oh wait, he's at Virginia. Now their quarterback wasn't too bad. The lefty, I don't remember his name. He threw for like
Brendan Armstrong.
Yeah, he threw for like 12,000 yards this year in that offense.
And that's what I was gonna say is, like, you've got Oklahoma State, which is really a run-based offense, at least since Mason Rudolph graduated, and now Virginia, which was like run and shoot, man. I mean, it was so much passing. Armstrong threw for over 400 yards several times last year. So, good move to transfer, right?
Yeah. And then another guy, and I've always liked him, and then he retired, so I don't even know if he's a draftable prospect, honestly. But that's Grant Calcaterra, former teammate of Kyler Murray, transferred to SMU, had a really good year, 6'4", 241, ran a 4.6 240. He's a guy that had to retire because of concussions. I don't know. Justin and I looked that up. Was that mandated by Oklahoma that he retired, or was that a personal choice? Do you remember?
My understanding was, in this situation, it was a personal choice. We've seen it it was Jalen Phillips who ended up transferring from UCLA to Miami.
Because the coaches wouldn't let him.
Right. So my understanding was Calcaterra was not mandated by the school, but I could be wrong on that. I don't have knowledge on that. But the thing is, like, I mean, he tweeted out that he was retiring. I think the kid just had a change of heart. He got healthy, and he missed playing, and then he came back for SMU. He had a really good season, and it's good to see him back. I mean, I don't think it has to be automatic for these guys. I think sometimes the system is a little bit too much of a babysitter for people.
And he came out and he moved well. He's always been a great receiving tight end, but you know, he I think he showed a little more this year at SMU, and then you don't have, but you're obviously going to be entirely too concerned at about his health issues. But I was actually
Well,
surprised
what
at
was
how
funny
well
too,
he
like he
tested.
had some familiarity with the quarterback too, right?
Yeah,
Mordecai,
'cause
what
was at
came from
Oklahoma as
Oklahoma
well.
as well.
Yeah, so this tight end class is really interesting because you have Trey McBride, who's supposed to be the guy, and I don't think he's bad by any means. I just think that he is. I think that he is being oversold as the clear-cut number one tight end in this class.
Seth, I agree 100%. I mean, it's just that you've got this guy, he's coming from, a group of five conference. His stats are juiced. As we talked about, the touchdowns aren't there. It's a volume stats, H back body, and you've got guys like I mentioned, Ruckert, who's coming from a blue blood program at Ohio State, has better size. He's gonna have fine athleticism, and although it's not always pretty, he's a better blocker than Trey McBride, or at least he projects to be. So, yeah, I think this tight end class isn't. It doesn't stink, but it's a little bit average, I think, and there's no first round tight end.
All right. Coming in next one of the Rise Up Sierra podcast, the best of Cardinals talking about. Let's go to the big guys. We're going to look at the offensive linemen and the defensive tackles, the kind of the interior players. That's coming next on Rise Up Sea Red. We're back on the Rise Up Sea Red podcast, the best of Cardinals talk on the web. Offensive linemen and defensive tackles. I know offensive line probably comes first, but how the heck does a man the size of Jordan Davis do what he did at that combine?
I mean, he's the closest thing to a bear that there is in this draft class. It's ridiculous that a guy like 340 pounds,
the speed,
he runs
the explosiveness on that broad jump.
It's insane. The fact that he's 340 pounds and he runs a sub 4.8 and has, like you said, Jess, the jumps, 32-inch vertical, over 120-inch broad jump, right?
Yeah, he was a foot longer than the next interior defensive lineman.
This is a situation where I talked about the combine is how you can get historical comps. There's no historical comp for Jordan Davis. There's not. The closest thing you can get to him is probably Rashid Higdon from a few years ago, and it's really not close enough. So it's a matter of pure projection for this guy because he didn't have any type of pass rushing at Georgia, but he is just an incredible freak. And what do you do with him? I almost want to deviate from my mantra, which is to not draft guys who are over 330 pounds who, project to like kind of niche roles. But he's so big and so athletic that I might just have to slot him in, to the top 10 or top 15 of my rankings because he's so unique. What do you do with a guy like this? Like, it's unreal. Like, you cannot. There's no projection for him. You have to have an imagination. As I said on our show earlier in the week, I'm just not that creative. So it's guesswork for me. He's a monster. What do you do with him?
Yeah, and it's crazy that his combine and his size overshadowed a lot of other guys because this is a freaky D line class overall. I mean, you mentioned Jordan Davis, uh, being 6'6", 340. You've got 6'4", 325-pound Travis Jones of UConn. He ran a 4.92, and he had a 110-inch broad jump. And you might be like, well, that's not that impressive, but that's the thing. That's how freaky what Jordan Davis did was, because typically a guy that's 325 and that's running a sub 5 is basically unheard of. And then to see him, have a 4.58 short shuttle and a sub, I believe he had a sub 7.3 cone. I want to double check, or just over 7.3 cone. Like, these guys are freaky athletic, and we didn't even mention like Devontae Wyatt, Jordan Davis's counterpart from Georgia. He tested out of his mind at 6. I think they list him at 6'3", 305. He had a 4.77, 29-inch vert, 111 broad. Like, those are really good numbers for plus 300-pound guys. And so,
yeah, Seth, not to interrupt, but you can at least find a comp for Wyatt. It's Quinnen Williams, right?
Right.
You can find a comp for Jones. It's Pot Roast, Terrence Knighton.
Right.
But you can't find a comp for Jordan Davis. There isn't one.
And again, we talked about it earlier. You don't chase unicorns, but this is a different type of unicorn, right?
Well, you're not chasing a unicorn. You found the unicorn.
Because you don't have anything to compare him to. So, Cardinals-wise, now, I'm guessing he will probably be long gone by number 23. There's no way Steve Keim lets him go, right?
No, I mean, I don't think you can. Like Justin said, you're talking about a guy that for the first time in years, from an athletic testing standpoint, has lived up to the billing of being this dominant interior defensive tackle. The last couple of years, we've had Quinnen Williams, we've had Derek Brown go in the top 10, and it was based on their play, and then they were, like you said, like Justin said, they're good athletes for their size, but it wasn't like they're freak athletes. Now you've got a guy that's got really good production on the field, lacks in pass rush, but when you watch him at Georgia, he came off the field a lot in pass rushing situations, which, because Georgia has so many athletic freaks that they're dropping into coverages, and they're able to do different things with guys. So Davis could be one of those kind of guys that is a true, and I know people think this is crazy, but like playing over 60% of snaps for 340 pounders is unheard of. And he's a guy that probably could do that. I won't be surprised if he goes in the top 15, honestly, because I just don't think there's any way he gets to 23. If he does get to 23, he 100% is, you have to draft him. And if you miss on him or he ends up being a bust, you tip your cap, because there's never been a player like him in the draft in the NFL's history.
Yeah, I mean, people who've listened to our show for a long time know that we're not really in favor of taking like a nose tackle in the first round, or definitely not in the top 20. But I think this is a player whose prospects kind of transcend that. And that if you have a defensive coordinator who's imaginative enough, or who can, set this guy up, I think you've got a player who can, at 340 pounds, can develop some pass rushing to him. And in that case, you've got a monster on your hands, and I think you've got to try.
More Vita Vea than, say, Eddie Goldman?
Oh, for sure. I mean, and it even goes beyond that.
Flipping it back to the offensive line, who were the offensive linemen who really stood out, one, and two, solidified themselves as the guys you want to draft, either at the top of the draft or guys you take a flyer on a little bit later?
I think the first guy, and he's a guy I've been on all off season, but Zion Johnson out of Boston College. Freaky testing numbers, 6'3", 312. A guy that, dominated at FCS Davidson, or no, Division II Davidson, right?
I think FCS, yeah.
FCS Davidson, and then was able to move up to Boston College, start at Boston College for a couple of years. His testing numbers are elite, and people will look at the 40 and be like, well, 518 is not elite, but this is a guy that had 32 bench reps on the bench press. He had a 32-inch vertical at 312 pounds, but it was his 7.38 3-cone and 4.46 short shuttle that really opened everybody's eyes about how athletic he is, in terms of a guy that was really thought of to be kind of a power phone booth type guard. And now you're seeing...
And Seth, look at the alignment that have come from lower divisions recently, and this is something I told you. He compares really well athletically to Ali Marpet. He just retired, but I don't think a lot of people would say that was a bad pick for Tampa. That worked out really well, and Zion has FBS tape on his side.
Yeah, so I mean, Zion's been one of the guys that's just completely, had a great combine, a great, off season overall that's made him, a unique player. Yeah, Marpet is, one of those interesting ones, like a Joe Thuney.
But and even taking it a step further, you've got Zion, who was a starter at Davidson, went to the FBS, became a starter, had a great Senior Bowl, had a great combine. Everything adds up to him being a first-round pick.
Right, and we've talked about it off the air. There's a real chance that if you're just talking about pure interior alignment and not moving Ike Ekwonu or Evan Neal, that Zion could be the first guy off the board. Because on the flip side, while Zion really, really did a nice job, a guy that kind of floundered a little bit, and it goes along with the running back we talked about earlier, was Kenyon Green. Green was, I got to pull up his numbers.
He did not do well. I've got him here. Kenyon Green. Hold on one sec here.
Yeah, so 5'2", 440.
Only 20 bench press reps.
Yeah, and a 5.12 short shuttle. Anything over, what's our cutoff? 4.75 usually.
Really, 4.75 is average. Really, my cutoff is 8-second 3-cone, 5-second short shuttle. If you're in the 8.5 club, the odds of you being successful are long. It just does not work out for you. You have to be in a pure power scheme. If anyone, we were talking about it off the air, I think. I was joking about how Draft Twitter loves when a guard pulls, right? If you're looking at highlights of a guard pulling and then he has an 8-second 3-cone and a 5-second short shuttle, forget it. He can't do that in the NFL. He's not going to get there in time. So just write that off. That highlight stinks. It doesn't matter.
What was it? Was that Dorian Johnson, or his name is?
Yeah.
And he was a guy almost universally selected or evaluated by writers as saying plug and play starter, even though he's drafted in the 4th round.
Absolutely, Jess, but not by us, not by me, not by Seth, and not by me. We were not in on him like that, and that's I really like Kenyon Green, but you have to say like he is a pure scheme projection, and then you have to question his upper body strength at this point. So the flags are out. I mean, I think the guy has good tape. He has versatility. He's played four positions on the offensive line in the SEC. But are you taking him in the first round? You
Yeah,
shouldn't. You
I don't
shouldn't.
think you can at this point. I think
No, you
it's
can't. And somebody might, and they'll be making a mistake.
another guy that had a really nice workout, and a guy that I think has improved his stock throughout the process as well, and mostly because of the fact that he put on almost 30 pounds from what he was listed at while at Memphis, and that was Dylan Parham. They listed him at 6'3", 311. He was listed while at Memphis at 285. Um, and so for him to come in at 311, have a decent, he had a really good 40 at 493, and then tested decently the rest of the way out, 778, 3 cone, 47 short shuttle. Um, and he's a guy that he worked at center while at the Senior Bowl. So he's a guy that is a true kind of a interior offensive line guy that can play any of the three positions. He started at both guard spots for entire seasons while at Memphis, helping. And remember, Memphis has churned out some really impressive backs over the last couple of draft cycles.
Oh yeah, I like Parham, and Zach Tom from Wake Forest is another player who's along the same lines, where he's played multiple positions. He tested really, really well athletically, and it's you don't think of Memphis or Wake Forest as football factories per se, but over in recent years, these programs have started to produce more and more NFL draft prospects. So those are two guys I really like that are kind of under the radar right now, and they had fantastic combines. In particular, Zach Tom.
A guy that really tested out of this world and is going to make a lot of people go back and watch his tape. But there are weight concerns in the true light, and that's Arizona State's own Kellen Deesh. Deesh kind of lit up the combine, 4.89 40, 32.5-inch vert, a 7.77 3 cone, but he had a 4.43 short shuttle, which is really, really elite in terms of short shuttle testing. But he only weighs 301 pounds. And so at 6'7", 301, you're talking about a guy that needs to put on 10 to 15 pounds. He didn't do the bench, and at that weight, that's always a concern. And then he's got shorter arms at 32.25 inch at 6'7". So he's not, and that's always a concern with these guys, is that these elite athletes with elite size or like elite height at 6'7", but that lack, maybe the strength or the thickness, but he moves extremely well. I hope Deesh can get to the third day, because that's where he belongs, because then you can bring him along slowly. Um, I worry that a team's going to jump on him because he did test out so well and really played, just okay while at ASU this year. I think you would probably agree with me on that. It wasn't like he was an elite um, guy while at ASU.
Yeah, Seth, I think he's going to be a day 3 guy because um, he has short arms, he's top heavy, and he is also going to be 25 before his rookie year. So he's a total kind of upside projection where you're not going to put him at left tackle. He's going to be a guard or he's going to be a right tackle, and you've got a lot of teams where you don't want to have a 6'7" guard because your quarterback is short these days. So that's something I don't think a lot of people talk about anymore. Like, some of these guys aren't athletic enough to play left tackle. In Deitch's case, he's athletic enough to play left tackle, but he doesn't have the arm length that you want or the experience. He's only a 2-year starter. So you don't want to put a project like that at left tackle. So what are you going to do with him? You're going to put him at guard, not for Arizona when you have a 5'9" quarterback, not even for Cleveland where you have a 6-foot quarterback. So, yeah, I think he's an interesting guy. I think he helped himself out a lot with his testing at the combine, because I think he goes from being undrafted to being drafted late, but he is still a kind of a niche prospect because he's not going to fit with every team.
Cutter Nixon of the Rise Up See Red podcast, the best ever Cardinals talk on the web. Let's bump to the edge and the linebackers. Not that we want to talk that much about linebackers because we already have too many of those on the Cardinals, but that's Cutter Nixon, Rise Up See Red. We're back on the Rise of See Red podcast, the best ever Cardinals talk on the web. We're going to move to the pass rush, to the edge rushers, and talk a little bit about the off-the-ball guys. I think Cardinals fans would like to see the Cardinals avoid any elite prospects at inside linebacker. Take a flyer on some guy late, but especially the pass rush, the edge guys. Who were the most impressive? We know that one of the most impressive was Trayvon Walker, and which leads to the interesting discussion about what do you do with a guy who performed at that level in terms of athletic testing, but then you look at his production, he had 9.5 total sacks in 3 seasons at Georgia. Which do you trust more?
So I think he's a prospect who's analogous to Ezekiel Ansah, coming out of BYU. Didn't have a ton of production from a sack standpoint, but you saw on tape there was the athleticism did show up. And with Walker, what's interesting is he shows up very well as a run stopper. I wasn't sure about his athletic testing because there's not a lot of pass rush. And you look at his high school numbers, there was a big jump. But he did improve in the areas where you might expect improvement in a good strength and training program. So there's some projection here. The thing about, and Jess, you brought this up before we started recording, but Ziggy Ansah was like new to the game, and Trayvon Walker isn't. So that's something to kind of be factored in here. Ziggy Ansah, when you're making that projection, can he become a great pass rusher? And using some imagination, you've got a player who's new to the game of football. Trayvon Walker, that's not the case. So now you've got like this scheme argument, and it's just it's a little bit different. I still kind of skew toward, I think you can make a projection here because you have a 275-pound athlete who's an elite athlete, and you can change this, you could put him in a certain scheme where he's going to have some production. So I have Trayvon Walker is the biggest adjustment I've made in terms of my rankings based on the combine. He proved he was an elite enough athlete where I can comfortably project pass rush ability for him and move him up in my rankings. And I don't really think there's anybody else in this class that I've really moved based on the combine.
One of the guys that's really opened my eyes over the workouts, and a guy that I think would be a really good fit at 55 for the Arizona Cardinals, is Nick Bonito, the pass rusher out of Oklahoma. He weighed in heavier than I expected. He's 6'3", 248. I was expecting him to be sub 240. So when he weighed in at 248, I was thinking we were going to struggle to hit some of the numbers that he needed to hit. 4.54 40 wasn't super surprising. Again, when you watch him play on tape, you saw a guy that was an elite athlete. He was just undersized. He turned in a 4.23 short shuttle, which is what some corners and wide receivers run. Now, it's not quite Aiden Hutchinson 4.15 numbers, but there's a reason that Hutchinson's being talked about to be picked first overall, right? But Benito's 4.23 was the second best short shuttle at the combine for edge or pass rushers. He comps out really well, actually, to a former Cardinal, and that's Hassan Reddick. But he's coming in strictly as an edge guy, and he's not going to be expected to move to and learn how to play off the ball. Instead, he's a guy that, from an athletic standpoint, can do a lot of what Vance Joseph wants to do and disguise. Even if he's just a third down pass rusher when he first comes in, he can come in and he can drop into coverage every once in a while if need to, because he has great hips and great flexibility and ability to change direction. But he is 100% a pass rusher already. And to me, that's a guy that I was worried about when he weighed in, that he was going to test poorly. And he ended up testing very well still. And so to me, that's a guy you look at and you go, all right, this is a guy, that we can look at as a potential, second round type of fit for the Arizona Cardinals.
Seth, I kind of almost take the opposite view of you, because I think he was listed in the 230s. So for him to come in almost at 250 and still test as athletically gifted as a guy like a guy in the 230s would, super positive outcome for Nick Bonito. And to have the production that he had coming out of the Big 12, I think he had a fantastic combine, and I really think he's kind of vaulted himself into that early day 2 conversation as a pass rusher. It was a good week for him. I think he kind of had become a forgotten man in some respects.
Yeah, I agree. I think a lot of people, because of this class. I mean, you look at it. A guy we'll throw out some quick names. Boy Mafi out of Minnesota, 4.53, 38-inch vert at 6'4", 261. So you're talking, a guy that tested at an elite level when it comes to jumps and 40 time. Arnold Ebiketie out of Penn State. We know those guys come in juiced, man. He didn't run, but he did jumps, and it was 38 and 128. I think we were a little disappointed to see only the 21 bench reps.
Yeah, I mean, but to your point here, Mafe is almost a full year older than Benito, and Ebiketie is like, I think 9 months older. So, yeah, there's a little bit of size discrepancy, but we hear a lot more talk. We've heard uh, both of those guys, Mafe and Ebiketie, talked about late first round. We haven't heard that with Benito. He's only a little bit lighter than these guys, and he's a lot younger.
The guys. So we've got obviously the names at the top of the draft. They're not going to even be available for the Aiden Hutchinson, Kayvon Thibodeau. Those guys are going to definitely be off the board. Other names like I don't know if they'll make it, but David Ajabo, George Karlaftis. I know he didn't do some of the testing. How do they match up athletically? And I know Ajabo. He's got 6'4", 250, tested the 4.55 on the 40. What's y'all's take on him in particular? I've seen mock drafts where he lands with the Cardinals. Where does he match up?
For me, Ojabo is a top 15 pick. I think he comps favorably to Cameron Wimbley, who, athletically and production-wise, coming out of Florida State. And Cameron Wimbley, this is one of those comps where people might say, oh, well, he was a bust. He actually was really good as a rookie and early in his career with Cleveland, with some really bad Browns teams. It's kind of what we were talking about before we started taping, Jess. Ojabo hasn't been playing football that long, and he had a freakishly good year this year, where he had double-digit sacks and like 6 forced fumbles. He knows how to disrupt the offense. He's a sack artist. He's a turnover artist, and I don't think that can be undersold. It's not the same position, but we have Charles Tillman, who developed the peanut punch. People know him about that. David Ajabo is a guy who forced a lot of fumbles this year at Michigan, and somewhat overshadowed by his teammate Aiden Hutchinson. But in some circles, some people think he's a better prospect long term than Hutchinson.
You mentioned Karlaftis. He's been projected either at or past the Arizona Cardinals. He didn't run everything, but he did do a couple things. Came in at 6'4", 266, 38-inch vert, which is incredible, and a 4.36 short shuttle, which is really, really good. I think the biggest concern people probably had was he only did 21 reps on the bench. But when you look at it from, the perspective of that vertical and then that short shuttle, you have an explosive athlete with good change of direction ability. Justin and I have been pretty staunch on that. Karlaftis is one of the 10 best players in this class. And I think that testing didn't really change anything.
And Karlaftis is I think 9 months or so younger than Hutchinson. He has longer arms, even though he's shorter. One of the things that, Karlaftis is an elite athlete because he was on the water polo team, the Greek national water polo team. And I don't know if anyone's ever played water polo, but you have to tread water for an hour.
Those guys are so. I have an old friend who did that in college, and
yeah,
whoa, wow.
This is a dude who's 260 pounds, and he's treading water for hours at a time. You don't understand the amount of strength or athleticism that takes. It's remarkable. I'm not concerned about the bench press. Seth and I have been talking about this for years. When you have longer arms, the bench press becomes less meaningful. I mean, it's certainly noteworthy if you have long arms and you put up a ton of reps, but it's not end-all, be-all. The fact that Karlaftis has that kind of vertical and that kind of broad jump, it indicates a tremendous amount of strength, especially lower body explosiveness. Not worried about his 40. He's going to he's going to have 40. So what if it's 4.8? It's still going to be explosive enough at that size where, I mean, he's a remarkable athlete. You don't have a ton of sack production, but you're also talking about it's not a blue blood program. He's going to be fine.
Anybody of note among the off-the-ball linebackers? Let's try and avoid the top guys in the first round because we don't want the Cardinals going anywhere near those. They can't. They can't really do that again, could they?
I hope not.
No way. Well, Devin Lloyd is the top guy, I think, and I think he's being a little bit oversold. I've compared him to Zach Cunningham, so he's a day 2 guy. We've seen him in mock drafts in the top 10. Like, that's wild to me. Because Lloyd's a good player, but he's a 4-year guy who runs a close to a 4.7, and I don't think all that blitzing and all that pass coverage is going to translate. So, I mean, I guess you talk about the Georgia guy, Nakobe Dean, and he's undersized as well. He came in at I think he came in at 229, but then didn't work out because I think the general thought is he actually plays closer to like 215. So I think he came in to the combine to weigh in at a strong weigh-in, but then he's going to shed weight for his testing. So I don't love off the ball linebacker in the first round ever. I think probably the most impressive guy from a testing standpoint might have been Damone Clark from LSU. He tested very well, and he also came in at like 6'2.5", almost 240 with long arms. Ran a sub 4.6 40. Had a huge year. Like, I think he might have led the FBS in tackle. So that's probably the most impressive guy, and I still think he's going to be there on day 2.
A couple day 3 guys for like the Cardinals if they need help at on special teams. DeMarco Jackson out of Appalachian State, 6'1", 233, ran a 4.55 40. He's been a special team standout on at App State, and can plug in over the course of the next couple seasons. Malcolm Rodriguez out of Oklahoma State, 5'11", but 230. God, can you imagine? But he ran a 4.52 and had a 39.5-inch vertical, which is absurd. Like,
Seth, wasn't he a quarterback in high school?
I think he might have been, yeah.
I think he was.
And so, yeah, I mean, 5'11", it's hard to see a guy that can play at that level. But he's, incredibly athletic, and again, big time contributor on specials.
All right, coming on next on the Rise of Red podcast, the best hour of Cardinals Tech on the web, where we've best hour nearly 2 it might end up getting to. Talk about the defensive backs. We're not gonna worry about the specialists. We don't care about what the specialists test at the combine, but defensive backs. That's coming next on Rise of Red. We're back on the Rise of Red podcast, the best hour of Cardinals talk on the web. Defensive backs who stood out, safeties and corners. The Cardinals don't really need safeties, but they could always use safety depth. So those are guys you're probably going to be looking at on day 3. Who are the cornerbacks of note athletically, at least from what we saw from the combine?
The guy we didn't see who's going to be the most athletic corner in the class is Derek Stingley Jr. And what's interesting about him, Seth and I kind of touched on this on our show earlier in the week. I think people are kind of forgetting how elite he is athletically and how, his freshman year was so fantastic. Now people are going to start to use the last couple of years against him, but 2020 was the COVID year, and then 2021 he had the Liz Frank injury. I get it. There's concern that Stingley is going to come back from that list, Frank, but there's no indication that he won't. It's not like some like 70s ACL career ender that things used to be like. So I don't really get it. I think there's some prospect fatigue there, where you have this fantastic prospect, but you haven't seen him for a while, so you just get bored with him and you start to slot other guys in. Now, obviously, people like Sauce Gardner from Cincinnati. I think there's something there, but you have a competition leap. You have a guy who's played a lot of zone. He hasn't faced a lot of elite receivers where he has to play man. I think that this is a player who has a lot of promise, but might have a steeper learning curve than people really think. So when you talk about corner, those are the two guys that are at the top of the list. And then you go to the Washington guys, Kyler Gordon and Isaiah McDuffie. And I personally I'm very not enamored with these guys. They don't have the on-ball production. And in Gordon's case, he was built as this athletic freak, and he ran a 4.5. So you've got guys with short arms who aren't as fast as they were built. So I'm not super high on this cornerback class.
Yeah, there's a couple guys that tested out of this world. The first one is a guy that Justin has talked about for a while, Tariq Wooten, out of University of Texas, San Antonio. 6'4", 205, ran a 4.2 640, has a 42-inch vertical. At his size, it's kind of like what you talked about with Jordan Davis earlier. The difference being he's not a guy that has shown ball skills. Now, Justin, he's the guy that moved over from wide receiver, correct?
Exactly. He was a receiver until 2 years ago. So he has only played corner for the last 2 seasons.
It's Brandon Williams.
Right, except he's done it in the in what, Conference USA? And he's built like Kevin King, who Seth and I talked about on our show earlier in the week. It's like I watched I poured over the Senior Bowl practice tape, not the one on NFL Network, like the actual tape, and I just did not see it with this guy. I mean, you have the elite athleticism, so you've got to kind of slot him into a certain area, but this guy's being billed as a potential late first rounder. No way. Not at all.
Well, and it seems some of the most athletic, at least the fastest guys, were guys who did not. We've got Zion McCollum 4.33. You've got
Kalen Barnes ran
yes,
4.23 out of
Baylor.
Yeah, and he he's kind of just a guy. He was a Texas State track champion, so that's not shocking.
Tyquan Thornton, a receiver from Baylor, was the fastest receiver. Again, this is a Shrine Bowl guy, not a Senior Bowl guy. To Jess's point, some of the all-time historic top 40 times don't translate to NFL success, so be careful.
Yeah, the guy that intrigued me the most, and we've talked about him before, was Roger McCreary out of Auburn, because he reminds me of now the guy's name's slipping my mind, that's got the wife that's a little off in the NFL.
Played for the Bucks.
Played for the Dolphins, right?
Brent Grimes.
Grimes.
Right?
Grimes.
Yeah,
right.
yeah. because he came in at 5'11", 190 pounds, but he's got super short arms at 28 and 7/8 inch. Ran a 4.5, but he plays incredibly physical. Like,
He also was timed at 4.4 out of high school. So we have like actual documented evidence that
that
he's
he,
faster than that. I really like that comp, and I really like that you brought McCreary up because Seth, you and I have been high on him all year, and he has tape against some really high prospects coming out of the SEC. And this is a really good example of like how the combine is just not the end all be all. So in some cases, I mentioned Trayvon Walker, where I've got to go back. I've got to project that he's going to be a better NFL player than the production that he has. But here is McCreary, who's a great example where I have to project, even in the face of some evidence where he might not be a great player, that his tape is good enough that he is going to be, in my opinion. And I think that's what Seth's getting at.
yeah, exactly. He's a guy that I feel like um, can play quite a bit. When you look at the safety class, it's pretty high end, and then it drops off pretty quick. I mean, you've got guys like Lewis Seen, Dax Hill, Jaquan Brisker, and then of course Kyle Hamilton. Those are the big names. Um, I think Hamilton's slightly disappointed at the combine when you look at his 40 time, but then you look at the rest of his stuff. He had near elite jumps at 6'4", 220, with a 38-inch vert and a 131-inch broad. Um, we've talked about it. I really akin him to like an Adrian Wilson type. Obviously, he's probably going to go in the top 20 where it's not going to be an issue for the Cardinals. But there are intriguing safeties in this class. We've talked about Baylor. They had a guy, JT Woods, at 6'2", 195, who ran a 4.36, had the 39.5-inch vert. Like, that's the type of guy that you look at and you go, okay, how does he do on special teams? Like, is he a guy that translates to special teams? And can you take him in on day late day 3 of the draft, because that's where you're looking at elite athletes, or for Steve Keim's sake, offensive linemen built like PE teachers. So that's usually what you're doing there. But yeah, I mean, JT Woods, and then Nick Cross out of Maryland, 6 foot 212. He ran a 4.34, had a 37-inch vert, 130-inch broad, really athletic. Again, you're not going to look at him and go, okay, I'm bringing him in to be a starter, but can he contribute immediately on special teams?
Yeah, I think you have a good read on this class. There are going to be these safeties, like your read on Cross is right, but what's going to happen is somebody's going to draft him earlier than that to be a starter. You mentioned JT Woods, Jalen Petrie from Baylor as well. He was like they loved him at the Senior Bowl because he was covering Trey McBride. We talked about McBride earlier. I think that's kind of a knock on him that this 5'10", 195-pound safety was blanketing him. Okay, so McBride did make the contested catch over Petrie, but then Petrie kind of looks good in the process because he's so much smaller. So he starts to get some kind of honey badger comparisons, right? It's interesting the way people grade safety. I've always thought that people grade safety kind of like they grade quarterback, in that there's a positional scarcity that pushes safeties up in the draft. And you don't have to look too far for this. Like the guy last year, Richie Grant from I think UCF, ends up going in the first round for Atlanta. That guy had no business going in the first round. You had Jimmy Ward going in the first round to the 49ers a few years back. He wasn't a first-round player. These guys are good players, but they're not first-round prospects. But you're chasing dragons here because you have a positional scarcity and you feel like these guys could play nickel and play safety. Don't do that with this safety class. I think, Kyle Hamilton, he is the guy, and the reason we're not too worried about his 40 time is because he's coming off a lower leg injury that caused him to miss most of the season. This guy, he's actually faster than what he timed. He's one of the few people I'll make an excuse for when it comes to the combine because he did have that injury and he does have that explosiveness. So when it comes to the safety class, I think there are guys being overvalued right now. And Kyle Hamilton, be careful. Don't let him fall too far. He's not – I don't think he's Derwin James. I don't think he's that good. But don't let him fall too far just because of that 40. He's still explosive.
Justin's worried he's going to fall to 20 and the Steelers are going to draft him.
Yeah, not going to lie.
Well, big thank you, Justin. This has been, you guys have been talking draft for, what, it feels like 4 hours probably now?
At least.
So,
well, it's probably been like about 11 years.
Just tonight. Just tonight. We will wrap up this edition of the show. Next week, we'll be back to normal programming, per se. We'll have a full week of free agency to kind of wrap our head around. Seth and I will go break that down, what the Cardinals have done, what's happened around the league and the NFC West. But Justin, thanks so much for the visit again, giving us basically an extra edition of the NFL, the extra of the original Draft Breakdown podcast, with me happen to be in the mix a little bit. So thank you, Justin. Thanks, Seth, as always. We'll be back. Seth and I will be back again next week. Thanks for listening. Go Cardinals, as always.
Thanks for listening to the latest edition of the Rise Up, See Red podcast. Listen to previous episodes and subscribe to the show on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher Radio, Audioboom, or many other podcast platforms so shows are delivered directly to your mobile device. Please give the show a 5-star rating and always support the sponsors who support the show. We'll be back soon for the best hour of Cardinals talk on the web. Rise up, Red Sea, be Red, See Red, and of course, Rise Up, See Red.